Coming up on this special edition of the Black Vault Radio. Join me as I explore the history behind the U.S. military and government's UFO research programs, beginning in the late 1940s, and I'll take you through today's revelation of a secret Pentagon UFO study known as AATIP. What is real? What is fiction? And what may be an outright lie?
For nearly the last decade, I ran a sensitive aerospace threat identification program focusing on unidentified aerial technologies. It was in this position I learned that the phenomenon is indeed real.
First of all, the project is completely unclassified, and there is nothing in the records which would indicate that we have been visited by any advanced civilization.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Prepare to take a journey through history from Project Sign to AATIP. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast and radio show of choice. I know there are tens of thousands of shows out there to listen to. I appreciate you making this one your choice to stream through iTunes or however else you are doing so. Thanks so much for tuning in, especially to those for listening for the first time to the Black Vault Radio. Welcome. What I do every show is really try and bring on the best of the best when it comes to guests and conversation and information. It all surrounds the blackvault.com and all of the 2 million plus declassified pages of documents that I have put online. What I try and do is bring them to life, and I do that by bringing some really amazing guests onto the show and have them share their expertise with me. Well, this show is actually going to be a little bit different. If this is your first time, in the past, I forget which episode number, but in the past, I put a kind of an idea out there to the audience. We have talked quite a bit, especially on the UFO-themed shows, which are very popular here on the Black Vault Radio. The UFO-themed shows, we've talked a bit about the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. I know some of you cringed that I just said AATIP / aviation and not aerospace like it was often touted in the media. Well, I put the offer out there that I would do a show just like this where I broke down the developments. There are a lot of ideas out there. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of erroneous information. There is a lot of incorrect facts that are floating around. There are CGI photos being touted as real. There's CGI animation stills being touted as real. There are all sorts of wrong things going on out there in the UFO field today. Well, that response was pretty amazing from all of you that have been listening. You wrote to me, you wanted me to do this show. Well, for those who did listen to my last episode with Mark D'Antonio, you will know that my baby daughter, who just turned 1 month old, put a monkey wrench into the wheel when it came to recording episodes. So I had a little bit of a few-week hiatus there. But I am happy to say I'm back at it. And being a holiday week, and again, a happy Thanksgiving to everyone listening here in America. Happy Thanksgiving. This week was a little bit tough to schedule a guest. Obviously, everybody is traveling with their friends, with their family, exactly how it should be. Well, I wanted to finally do that show for all of you who have requested it. And if you have no idea what the heck I'm talking about with that request, let me tell you a little bit about what I want to do. Obviously, the last year, about approximately a year, has been very interesting in the field of ufology. In December of 2017, we had the announcement of a quote-unquote secret Pentagon UFO study, or at least that's what the media was saying that the military was up to and the U.S. government was up to. What I want to do is break that down. Now, I've received quite a bit of heat in the last year because of my skepticism towards exactly what all this means and what it all is. So I'm going to get into that. But in addition, this isn't just going to be a trashing AATIP, trashing To the Stars Academy show. I want to kind of take you back before all of this, make it a little bit of a historical lesson on how did it all begin decades and decades ago. What does the U.S. military and government want you to believe? What do the documents say? And I will take you from the late 1940s all the way through the present day. Yes, I will focus on the more present day information and break down all of that, but I finally want to do that for you guys. I won't have a guest this episode, but I hope that doesn't turn you guys off from listening, because I think this is an important topic. And I do think that there is a lot of false information that is circulating out there that shouldn't be. And you guys and girls deserve better than that, honestly. It sounds cheesy, but I have devoted my life to this topic and just don't think that it's fair that some people go out there, tout false information, and get attention to this, because that will backfire. I'll get into all of that here in the TBV Dialogue segment, wherein I'm going to break down that entire history going back decades all the way to today, and I will make my case on why I am skeptical and why you should be skeptical as well. That doesn't mean we should doubt. That doesn't mean we should debunk. That just means we should ask questions. And in turn, those that are asking for 50 million of our U.S. dollars, although that round of investment is over, but they were asking for 50 million of our United States dollars from you, from me, and anyone else who would write that check. I think that they should answer some of these questions. They could have easy answers. I'm always open to that. They could say the government's lying to me. I could be open to that too. But regardless, I think they should answer it nonetheless. So I'll get into all of that, break it down for you. Before I get into it, though, I wanted to say thank you also for all of your feedback from the last episode, wherein I changed the format a little bit, dropped the TBV News segment. To my surprise, got quite a bit of feedback, and very quickly once that episode dropped. I do hear you. What I'm going to go ahead and do is leave it off of this particular format. That way we get to the guests and the main brunt and content of the show a little bit quicker. But also it paves the way for something new. A new show that you can listen to wherein I talk about those controversial headlines, whether they be from the world of science, government, declassification efforts, secrecy, and of course paranormal and UFO related issues that are ever so popular right here on the Black Vault Radio. So that being said, I really appreciate you tuning in, making this the show that you decided to listen to, because this time on this holiday week here in America, I'm going to break down that history of UFO research and UFO involvement by the United States military and United States government, starting from the late 40s all the way to the present day. We'll see what it really all means. That's coming up on this special edition of the Black Vault Radio. In this episode's TBV Dialogues segment, I decided to do something a little bit special. This ties back to a previous episode wherein I put the offer out there that I would talk about the newest headlines that have circulated in the mainstream media about the UFO topic, and that is specifically about AATIP, what is called the secret Pentagon UFO Study, or at least that's what many headlines called it. However, controversy surrounded this since day one, if you really started to read through the various newspaper articles, and that was conflicting names for the program, and a few other facts kind of stuck out, at least to me anyway, that something didn't sit right. Now, the response from the offer for me to do this was pretty awesome, and decided to go ahead and on this Thanksgiving week here in America, since scheduling was a little bit rough with everybody doing the traveling and being with their family, to sit down and do that episode that you wanted me to do. Now, the kind of twist that I want to do, not really a twist, but the extra content, so to speak, is I'm going to take you back a lot farther. I'm not just going to dissect the present day rumored Pentagon secret UFO study, but I want to give those who listen to this program, because obviously this isn't a UFO podcast. This is not specifically a UFO radio show. Although we deal with that topic quite a bit, that's not everything that we deal with. And the feedback that I've received from many of you, it shows me that although you're not here for UFO information, or you're not here for the JFK assassination, or you're not here for this secret or that secret, you're here to learn. And that is exactly why I do this show. Some of it for those real seasoned JFK assassination investigators, you may hear some review material. For those seasoned UFO investigators that have read every book out there, some things are review for you. But I always aim to bring something new, to bring ideas or to make you think, to teach and to look at the real history versus what the U.S. government or the military has said. In essence, I aim to challenge you, because you know what? You guys and girls challenge me. You challenge me to stay on my toes and bring forward the facts. Bring forward the good information, and that is what I aim to do. Now, I don't know everything, far from it, just ask my wife. But not everything comes across my desk, which is why I wanted to start this program, which brings those voices, those experts to the table. Now, the problem with kind of dissecting UFO history, which is what I'm going to do, is that it is a very dark and twisted history where you have to read between the lines on a lot of this. The recent developments didn't help. In fact, arguably, it may be hurting the field of UFO research. Maybe not in the quick of it. Maybe not here in the first 6 months, 8 months, year after the announcement of this secret Pentagon UFO study. But my concern are some of the red flags that have popped up, and now they have increased in numbers as the months have gone on. And I have really focused hard to bring the truth to you. So in order to do that with this show, what I want to do is go back, and I want to bring you the documented history. Now, I'm stressing that documented history of the UFO research within the U.S. military and the U.S. government. Now, the reason I say documented UFO history is you've got a lot of whistleblowers and you've got a lot of leaked documents. You have a lot of books out there that, I mean, I'll be honest with you, some of them have kind of made up some facts. Not all of them, don't get me wrong, but there are things that are made up that are not necessarily accurate. So what I'm going to do with this show is bring you the story, going back to the late 1940s, taking you all the way through to today with the real documented history. Now, there is a lot there. And in lieu of doing a 15-hour show for you, I am just going to scratch the surface. Here is my shameless plug for a book that I'll be releasing in April. As I record this, I'm actually taking a break from looking through the final proof. I'm really excited about this because consider this show a taste of what that book is all about, because I really go into detail with the documents, breaking down the history, looking at the players involved, the agencies involved, and ultimately my journey in figuring out what this story was. That plays a role in why I get so passionate when people make claims about U.S. military or government involvement with UFOs. And I'm not just picking on the TTSA or To the Stars Academy world right now, but rather those that are the quote-unquote whistleblowers with the secret space program. They bring stories to you that don't have any evidence to back it up. It sounds great. It looks great on paper, but sadly, there's no evidence. So that really plays a role into my passion, because many have asked me, why are you, quote unquote, attacking those that have come out with these stories? And I don't attack, I question. Sadly, in this day and age, people equate questioning as attacking, and we should not be there. We should not be in that mindset. So my goal with this show, take you back and give you that breakdown. Now, in order to do that, I want to start a little bit with my history. If you don't know my history with some of this, I started when I was 15 years old and started with the UFO phenomenon. I was fascinated by the unknown. I was fascinated by UFOs. And at the time, this was 1996, I'm going to age myself here. I was 15 years old. Google wasn't even a thing. Now we don't say we search the internet for, you just say, I Googled it. Google was not a word back then. The search engine of the time was Alta Vista. And I remember, even at the time, you search the word UFO, you'd come up with hundreds of thousands of pages, right? And that was just at the time. Now it's in the tune of millions. I was fascinated by that number, that there was so much information out there. I mean, I was literally a little kid in a candy store, looking at the internet, trying to figure out what the truth behind UFOs were. You ever done that? You know that you're going to get a lot of crap. Even back then in 1996, you do it today, it's a million-fold over, but when you do it in 96, there was a lot of stuff out there that just didn't make sense, and it was unsubstantiated, lacked evidence, wasn't there. Well, where I came to learn about the Freedom of Information Act was a website that talked about declassified U.S. government documents, one in particular, which was the 1976 Iran incident. Now, if you're not familiar with the 1976 Iran incident, it was a fascinating story. The gist of it is, in September of 76, there was a UFO that was seen in Tehran. And the base commander was starting to receive phone calls from the people in this general area. And they were asking, what do you guys have in the air? What are you guys flying? And he says, well, and paraphrasing here, but there was nothing in the air. And he told people, you're seeing a star in the sky. And after a couple phone calls, he finally got tired of it. So he goes outside with field binoculars, looks off into the distance, and sure enough, he sees a UFO, a craft that should not be there. Now, this declassified document goes on to say that the base commander scrambled an F-4 Phantom jet to go take a look. And on approach, it got about 24 nautical miles from the UFO. And something strange happened. Everything shut down on his aircraft. Everything. No communications, no controls. Now, as this plane just kind of slowly, as the document says, kind of slowly drifts away, regains everything, he goes back to base. A couple minutes later, they scramble a separate crew with a separate F-4 Phantom jet. They just thought it was a plane malfunction. He gets about 24 nautical miles from this UFO. Now, just like the first F-4, something strange happened, but he didn't lose all control this time. This time, a second UFO appeared out of the first one, dropped out from underneath it, and went straight forward towards that approaching F-4 Phantom jet. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, if you're a pilot or just use some common sense. If you're flying a plane and you see something come off of an airplane, an aircraft, a craft of some kind, whatever it may be, it comes off of that plane and it shoots directly at you, what are they doing? And of course, you're going to think this is an aggressive maneuver. This is a missile. This is now, instead of a chase, this is actually a dogfight. And so the second UFO heads straight for the F-4 Phantom jet. Now, this pilot obviously panics. He starts to arm his missiles, and he goes to fire. And 3, 2, 1, he clicks the button ready to fire back. Everything turns off. No controls, no communications, no nothing. As the document says, this incoming UFO, at this point the pilot thinks it's a missile, is about to hit the aircraft. It's about to, destroy this F-4 Phantom jet. But instead of doing that, it dips down, loops around his aircraft, and then rejoins the original UFO. It flies all the way back, and it's a perfect rejoin. Now, this pilot, when a jet loses control and power, you don't just fall out of the sky. I mean, he's in what they called I believe, a slow controlled dive, or descent. Excuse me, not a dive, but a slow controlled descent, wherein he's losing altitude but coming down, or at least that's the impression the document gives. After that second UFO rejoins the first one, a third UFO comes out of the side of the primary one. So you're obviously talking about a rather sizable aircraft. According to the document, the pilot, and obviously he survived, not to do a spoiler alert here, but he described the object, the original UFO, as 1/3 the apparent size of the moon. That is a verbatim quote from the document. Now, what that means is as a pilot, if you see a full moon in the sky, think about that size, chop it in a third, and at about 24 nautical miles, which is, I don't have the conversion in front of me, but I believe it's something to the effect of 26 miles or, around there. Don't kill me because I know I'm off on that number, but, it's a sizable difference. So when something is that far away and you see it as 1/3 the apparent size of the moon, that is a rather sizable craft. And to have multiple other craft come out of it, like this report says, you're talking about something big. Science fiction would call it a mothership. That's the only way to really describe something like this, okay? So this third UFO appears out of this original craft, this mothership, if you want to call it that, comes out of the side of it, but instead of coming straight towards the F-4 Phantom jet, it goes straight down at a great rate of speed. Now the pilot, again, not falling out of the sky, he's able to watch this thing go over the earth, the ground, and cast a light, according to the document, about 1/3 of a kilometer in diameter. Now, once he saw that, this is where something strange happened. What happened next, right? I mean, okay, a craft comes down, shining a light on the ground. What happened next? Is this like, if you're familiar with the Socorro landing, did bodies come out? Did they walk around on Earth? Did they shoot a laser beam? I mean, what happened? And the report actually skips that. They skip ahead that the F-4 Phantom jet pilot regained everything and went back to the military air base. But what happened after this thing went towards the ground? And that kills me that I don't have an answer for you. But this report just seemingly skips all of that. After he goes back to base and he's going, he regains everything on his aircraft. He's going back to base. The report says that he saw a fourth cigar-shaped UFO while he had to go out on a long approach. So his instrumentation was back. He had control of his aircraft. But according to the document, not everything worked. So what happened is he had to go way out into the desert, turn around, and do a long approach because his instrumentation was not working right. So he had to do a long approach and land at the base. While doing that, he sees a fourth cigar-shaped UFO. So obviously something was going on in this area. Now I'm reading this document, right? This story. I'm reading this document. I'm fascinated. I'm 15 years old. I have no idea what the Freedom of Information Act even is. And I found this document. I'm hooked. And towards the end of the document, it says that the pilot went out the next day via helicopter to the area where they believed that this UFO cast the light on the ground. Now, again, no indication of what happened. Now, they didn't see anything on the ground. No footsteps, no landing pads, no nothing. But they did find a shack a short distance away. They landed the helicopter. They went to go question the residents. And they said that they heard a lot of really loud noises the night prior, saw really bright lights shining through the window, but would not dare go outside to figure out what was going on because they were terrified. The report ends that they took soil samples in that area and that they were going to test it for radiation, and they were going to forward the results when available. That's how the document ended. Absolutely fascinating. And that's what got me hooked. That is kind of a personal story to me, just simply because that started my curiosity that regardless of what the government and military wants you to believe, which is UFOs aren't real, they're not alien, when you look at the actual evidence, right? This was a real document, or allegedly a real document when I read it. The reason I say that is because I was reading it on the internet. Now, contrary to popular belief, if something is on the internet, it is not true. I know that might surprise some of you out there, but that is the reality, that if you read it on the internet, not necessarily a real story. So I read this and I thought, okay, if this is a real U.S. government document, how can I get it? And this website talked about the Freedom of Information Act. I had no idea what that thing was. But they said, if you doubt the legitimacy of this document, you too can get it. And you file a Freedom of Information Act request, you send it off, and the government agency will send it to you. Namely, for this specific document, it was the Defense Intelligence Agency, or the DIA. Now, I was hooked. I stutter because I was excited to know that the government would send me something for free. Let alone, like, the document was fascinating, but even more so as a little kid, I thought, wow, this is great. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which, by the way, at the time I had never heard of either. I had no idea what that agency even was. We hear about the CIA and the FBI all the time, but the DIA, like, what the heck is that? So I thought, hey, if they're going to send me something, cool. So I filled out this letter. They kind of give a form letter to fill out, send it off, and see what happens. So that's what I did. And to my surprise, a few weeks later, that document shows up from the United States government, the DIA, in my mailbox. Verbatim, it was absolutely real. That story that really sounds like it was from an X-Files episode shows up in my mailbox, and the government says, this is a real report. And that was it. I was hooked. Here we are 22 plus years later, 2 million pages later, and that curiosity has only gone deeper. And I'm guessing you can probably understand why. Now, why did I tell you this story? Well, I wanted to let you know on what started my journey in trying to figure out what the military and the government here in America actually had on the UFO topic. And to figure that out, it was the Freedom of Information Act that was going to allow me to access whatever documents were that were out there. So I started filing FOIA requests. And I'm telling you, I sent them everywhere, 20, 30, 40 at a time. I was sending them to agencies, Air Force bases, headquarters, Pentagon, you name it. I was probably targeting them to figure out what UFO information they had. And what I learned during this process really lays the groundwork for the history of the UFO phenomenon. And the history goes back to the late 1940s, about 1947, when the U.S. military realized that the UFO topic was a problem on different levels, but it was a problem. And it all started with the Roswell incident. And it all started really with the amount of attention that it got in the months and years that followed, not only the Roswell incident, but the UFO phenomenon as a whole. And so they created these investigation programs. Here in America, these were the first investigations into whatever the UFO phenomenon really was. It had started with Project Sign, then later Project Grudge, and then in 1952, it ultimately became known as Project Blue Book. Now, Blue Book is more of the household name, so to speak, especially with History Channel coming out with their own drama series with that name. Everything kind of went under that umbrella of Project Blue Book. Ultimately, I mean, you can get down to the nitty-gritty, and it's a little bit, they vary with details, but let's just be a little bit broad here and say each of them had an angle of investigating UFOs and ultimately figuring out what in the world that it was. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is the story. This is what I call the company line. I go into great detail in the book that's coming out next April about what the company line is. And what I mean by this is that the U.S. government and the U.S. military touts the company line about UFOs, and they go back to Project Blue Book. This is the root of the company line. This is the basis of where they get off saying UFOs aren't real, they're easily explainable, and they are definitely not alien. Nor are they a threat to national security, because that was a big one to the military and the government, especially through the 40s and 50s, when this phenomenon was really showing that it absolutely was a threat. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But that was their conclusion, and it was Project Blue Book and the trifecta of projects that went along with that. It was Blue Book and the results from that allows them to say it. Now, on the surface, it sounds great. It sounds like they went through these investigations. In fact, there were over 12,000 investigations, 12,618 to be exact. Now, according to the official record, this is actually probably not true, and I think a lot of researchers have put up a case to show that this isn't true, but the official word from the government is that they investigated 12,618 sightings, but only 701 remained unidentified. Now, they explain the 701 being unidentified just simply because of lack of facts or lack of evidence to truly figure out what the UFO was or what would explain the case. They loved explanations like swamp gas, the planet Venus, Jupiter, hallucinations, you name it, they came up with it, except physical craft that possibly could be outside of this world. When the military started seeing this, obviously that was a little bit of a problem for them because they wanted to blame those physical craft that were in the sky on military aircraft and so on. But then all of a sudden, even their military pilots were seeing it. So this was a fairly big issue. So Project Blue Book was touted as this scientific investigation. And when I started filing these FOIA requests, they really want you to believe what I just told you. And from 1947, starting with Sign, through 52, starting with Blue Book, through the end of 1969, and technically Blue Book closed in January of 1970, they want you to believe that that's it. Those 22 years are all they needed to figure out what the UFO phenomenon was. On the surface, sounds great. Just don't ask questions, because once you ask questions, once you look at the evidence, another picture emerges. And that picture is the fact, the reality, that Project Blue Book was likely not an investigation, but rather it was an explanation. When you look at the evidence, you see quite a bit to support that. Now, from the CIA, we learned years later that in 1952, they convened something called the Robertson Panel. Now, the Robertson Panel, headed by Howard Robertson, the Robertson Panel really had a goal, and that was to evaluate the UFO information up until that point. Now, on the books, they had only done about 5 years' worth of research. I don't know what the exact number of cases by this point were. However, it obviously was a far cry from the 12,618 that they did in total. But on top of that, they wanted to evaluate this evidence for intelligence purposes and figure out, is this phenomenon a threat? Now, according to declassified records, namely those from the CIA, we kind of get an inside look that they evaluated the evidence and they claimed that the UFO phenomenon was not a threat to national security. However, there was a threat to national security, and that was you and I. Well, you and I at the time. The citizens, the general public, the ability that we had to pretty much overrun and to overutilize the resources of the military and the government. And we would do that by telephone calls, letters, demanding answers, protesting even. If we were to overwhelm that system, that was a threat to national security. There was a growing interest by the general public to figure out what this phenomenon was. They needed to figure out who and what was causing these sightings. Because keep in mind the era that we were in. The fall of the Third Reich and the attack with nuclear weapons in Japan, that was just a couple years prior to all of the hoopla about UFOs starting. So this may or may not have been alien, right? We could deal with that later. But this could have been Soviet. This could have been leftover technology from Nazi Germany. This could have been the Japanese finally getting retaliation. There were a lot of things that this could have been. Now, fast forward decades, we kind of go, no, that couldn't have been true because of XYZ. Well, you're right. We just didn't know it at the time. That was the issue. And so I think you really need to look at the historical context that in 1952, the Robertson Panel was convened. And let me rephrase that. In late 1952, and then they were finally at the table in about January of 53 is what I think the documents say. So I want to make sure I'm accurate there. All of that stemmed from the the summer of 1952 Washington, D.C. sightings. Now, the Washington, D.C. sightings are very historically important. And the reason why is because, number one, they're just unexplained. But number two, it showed the true national security threat that the UFO phenomenon was here in America. And that was the reality that they could fly in and out of any area that they wanted, whenever they wanted, and no one could do anything about it. They were seen, the UFOs were seen over the Capitol building, over the White House, and various military installations, even as the years progressed, those with nuclear weapons. This phenomenon truly was, by definition, a threat to national security. Now, that threat to national security, according to the Robertson Panel and the CIA, wasn't there. So go figure. The documentation was already there to support it. You only need 1 out of 1,000 cases that's over a military installation or the White House or the Capitol building to show a threat to national security. They had multiple cases by this time, and yet they say, nope, the only threat is the general public. They ask questions, they can overwhelm our resources. We need to get them out of here. We need to get them to lose interest, stop asking questions. And this, in my opinion, is where the true cover-up began when it comes to the UFO phenomenon. This is where the U.S. government and the military said, we need to squash this. To do that, our PR campaign is Project Blue Book. Yeah, it's a scientific investigation, blah, blah, blah. We need to explain everything. And I think that that's where it really became a debunking program, that explanation, rather than an investigation. All the evidence you need for this is you look at Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Now, I look forward to the History Channel series in the early episodes of the Black Vault Radio in the news segment, which I've dropped. But in the news segment, I did talk about the Project Blue Book series and expressed my concern that they may not stick to history. History is fascinating enough. I hope they don't dramatize it too much, because Dr. J. Allen Hynek, for those who don't know, was the scientific advisor. He goes back to the early Project Sign days in 1947. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek He ultimately went in as that scientific consultant. He wasn't military, but he was asked by the military, hey, look at these things, figure out, what they are, and let's put a label on them. The U.S. military pretty much already had an explanation, and that was UFOs aren't real, they're not alien, and not a threat. They tasked Dr. J. Allen Hynek to say just that, but surround it with some science. So you've got the swamp gas planet Venus and fill in the blank, and all of those explanations began to emerge. Dr. Hynek was very much a debunker in those early days and even as the years progressed. But there was a problem. This was a huge problem that began brewing within the United States military. After evaluating the evidence, and Dr. J. Allen Hynek being a true scientist, the evidence became overwhelming. The evidence started to prove that not only were UFOs real, they weren't as explainable as the Air Force wanted us all to believe. They were a threat to national security, and we just couldn't explain all of them. Fast forward through to the end of Project Blue Book, and you actually have a scientist who came out and created his own UFO research organization. Now, when you look at that fact alone, that has to tell you that those original investigations were bunk. That original scientific approach was nothing but. When you have the lead scientist come out and go from that debunker to a believer, that has to tell you something, that Project Blue Book was not necessarily the investigation that we are led to believe. And the company line wants to lead you to believe that that was the end all. 12,618 cases, only 701 remained unidentified. Don't ask questions, just go away. That's exactly what they wanted. Now, after this, that summarized Project Blue Book, okay? I hope that at least shows you that original 22-year span of investigating this, they didn't do a good job. They didn't really, they didn't approach it in the true scientific way that it should have been. Dr. J. Allen Hynek comes out, and that was, I think, what his aim was. Behind the scenes, though, when you start looking at the documents and you start looking at the evidence, you start realizing a different picture. Now, I told you about the 76 Iran incident already. What's key about that I have not talked about yet? Project Blue Book ended in the end of 1969, beginning of 1970. The company line, in the form of what they call a United States Air Force fact sheet, I'll link this in the show notes. The fact sheet says, in much briefer detail about Blue Book, everything that I just talked about. However, they end it saying that no government agency has ever taken an interest in UFOs since the close of Project Blue Book. Why? There's no scientific reason to do so. There's no threat to national security that they needed to address. And they go out of their way. I've even got one agency that highlighted no other government agency. I mean, they're very adamant about saying that there is just no interest in this phenomenon. Yet again, don't ask questions, just go away. Because why? When you start using the FOIA and you start asking questions in that legal way, all of a sudden, a different picture emerges. That different picture shows you that they are absolutely looking into the UFO phenomenon for years. I've already talked about the 1976 Iran incident. That's about 6 or 7 years after the close of Project Blue Book. Now explain to me what the significance is behind documenting and archiving that type of intelligence from another country. Why would you do that? It's because they have an interest. They know that it's a threat. Here we are in 2018, almost 2019, and we still, to this day, could not necessarily replicate with our current known technology a UFO that shuts down strategically multiple F-4 Phantom jets, can fly in various directions with multiple craft inside of it. We can't connect that to anything. If we read this story and, erase the story that I told you, If the 1976 Iran incident talked about an aircraft that didn't show up on radar and looked like a flying wing, well, we could connect that to something nowadays, right? We can say, well, you know what? We didn't know it in 76, but that was the B-2 stealth bomber. That was the flying wing design going back to even Nazi Germany when the Horton brothers designed a flying wing, and Jack Northrop envisioned doing a flying wing. We could connect that. There's a history to support the decades that had passed from the UFO encounter, but there's evidence to support an explanation. There's no evidence to support an explanation on that. That is just one encounter out of quite a few. And my Freedom of Information Act requests, they started bearing out that there were a lot of other types of documents that were out there. Now the question is, well, Blue Book closed. The UFO investigation had already stopped. So what is with all of these? Now there's a lot of publications that history will show you. Well, some go back to Project Blue Book days, and others go post Project Blue Book days. One is JANAP 146E. Now JANAP stands for Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication, and then the number was 146, and then the revision was E. So when they do these revisions and manuals, they start with A and B and C and so on, and they have these different designations as they get rewritten over the years. Now, although JANAP 146E was not on the books when I entered the UFO field in 96, it was still interesting nonetheless because it did go post Project Blue Book and possibly connected to these UFO documents, these UFO cases, these UFO investigations. It was still very much a kind of a mystery, but there was documentation to support that some interest was still there. So there's a lot here, and I'm going to skip it, but there's a lot here in this point of my story where I started uncovering thousands of pages that were not supposed to exist. Now, for the purpose of this show, I'm talking about UFO investigation programs, so I'm going to fast forward you. Even though these thousands of pages on UFOs existed, I wanted to dig in. This is going back to at this point, about 1999, 2000, circa, where I had already seen JANAP 146. I don't claim to have discovered that. That was written about for many years. Please don't think I'm trying to lay claim to that. That was just something that I read about and learned about. But it had been rescinded. It was not an active publication. At this point in my research, I wanted something active. I wanted something real. Something that was on the books. JANAP was real. Let me rephrase that. But I wanted something that was current. So I started filing various requests trying to uncover other information out there. Now, one last thing I'll say about JANAP. JANAP specifically talked about how to report UFO sightings when and where. It was a publication that outlined, documenting the speed, the shape, the size, and so on. So it really kind of outlined, hey, if you see a UFO, this is how you do it. JANAP being Joint Army Navy Air Force publication. So the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force were all kind of subject to this JANAP 146. What I wanted to know was, where did these documents go? The documents, when they were created, so if you were an Air Force pilot, you see a UFO, JANAP 146, when it was on the books, mandated you to create a report. This was called a service report. The acronym was CIRVIS. That's Communication Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings. Yes, that's a mouthful. Now, these service reports made under JANAP, according to the publication, were sent to the NORAD installation. Now, when I started filing FOIA requests and trying to figure stuff out, and I knew that service must be a key to these more present-day UFO sightings, I did mention the thousands of pages that I had already uncovered at this point. And again, that would make the show 15 hours long. But what I will say briefly about those thousands of pages is that they were not service reports. So this did not connect to JANAP 146. There were a lot of other intelligence files, documents that shouldn't have existed, case files that shouldn't have happened, incidents that should never have occurred. All of that were in these thousands of pages. But JANAP talked about these service reports at NORAD, so I thought that something was to service. Now, I'm going to date myself again here and kind of geek a little bit on you with Alta Vista. But Alta Vista, which the search engine of the day back in the late 90s, that really is the credit to where I made this next discovery. It wasn't even through the FOIA, although the FOIA came about shortly thereafter to confirm it and take the next step. But I started looking around, and on accident, using Alta Vista, searching surveys, going through military sites, trying to figure out what was out there. Because again, I knew JANAP was gone at this point, not on the books anymore. What if Service was connected to something else? And I came across a reference to an Air Force manual by the number designation 10-206. Now, Air Force Manual 10-206 was pretty interesting. When I started finding references to this, and then later finally found the actual manual itself, I was pretty fascinated by it because it broke down in Chapter 5 unidentified flying objects. Chapter 5's title was Communication Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings, or SERVIS. Now, I don't want to diminish the discovery of JANAP 146. But the problem that I had with it as an investigator at the time, a rather new one and green investigator, but investigator nonetheless, was that not only was it rescinded, but it was also applicable to Canadian forces. Even though it was Army, Navy, Air Force, it also connected to Canada. So for me, I wanted more than a joint publication as strong evidence. And the reason I say that is because that gave the United States an out. They can say, well, we've rescinded the fact that we follow that, but Canada does, and it's Canada, so we don't care. You know, something, it was an out. And that's no offense to my Canadian friends. But what I mean by that is the fact that that was the out for them, that this was not a manual specific just to them. It was joint. So when I found 10-206, this was an Air Force manual with Department of the Air Force, with the Department of the Air Force seal at the top. This was only applicable to the Department of the Air Force. Let me go back a little bit. Who ran Project Blue Book? The Department of the Air Force. Who created the company line? The Department of the Air Force. Who tells you and I there are no UFO research programs out there? There are no government agencies or military bases or anyone involved with the UFO phenomena. That would be the Department of the Air Force. What happened here? Now I've got a on the books Department of the Air Force Manual 10-206 that stated specifically about service reports, but drilling down in that Chapter 5 was specifically unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. There were no secret acronyms. There was no unknown aerial phenomena. There was no... That stuff is all silly. That whole debate in this day and age about changing the acronym of UFO is silly. Not only at the allegation that the military has done it, but with the private sector push to do it. A UFO is a UFO. We don't need to rewrite 60, 70 years worth of history to this. It doesn't automatically mean alien. It is a real phenomena, whatever it is. Yes, I said phenomena, plural. I'll deal with that later if you want me to, but often I am ridiculed for saying that on television, but I mean it. It is a phenomena. There are multiple facets of whatever this is, alien or not. It is not just one phenomenon. It, in my opinion, is a phenomena. So that being said, I find this manual and I realize there is something to this. It is on the books. Now, specifically, this was Air Force Instruction, also referred to Air Force Manual 10-206. The latest revision at the time of me finding it was 1998. I had discovered it in 2001. As the years progressed, this stayed on the books. And through that time, there are an unknown number of service UFO-related reports. Now, why do I say unknown? Well, when you look at Air Force Instruction or Manual 10-206, and you look at Chapter 5, it specifically states UFOs as one of a few things to report. Now, just to be accurate, some of the other things to report are missiles. So if you see a missile in the sky, hostile or unidentified aircraft, hostile or unidentified military surface vessels or submarines, and any other individual surface vessels, submarines, or aircraft of unconventional design engaged in suspicious activity. That is me reading from Air Force Instruction 10-206. Now, where do they go? And if you thumb through this manual, you realize they go to the NORAD installation at Peterson Air Force Base. So, naturally, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to NORAD. I really, really thought this was it. I was going to really uncover something here that had never been out before. JANEP, again, had been discovered and written about for many years. Air Force Instruction or Manual 10-206, not so much. In fact, no one had ever talked about it before. And I've searched long and hard. This proved that the Air Force was lying. Now what I wanted was the documentation that go along with it. Not only will it prove that they were lying, but it proved that they were actively involved in UFO research. So I filed that FOIA request to NORAD, asked for everything, service reports, everything that I had essentially found in this Air Force instruction that would be reported, specifically the UFO stuff. This was the place that they were all going to. Filed that FOIA request and I got a response. Now, I won't read the whole letter, but it stated in part, quote, NORAD is a binational command established by Volume 33, United States Treaties, page 1277, subject to control of both Canadian and U.S. government agencies as defined in the Act, and is consequently not subject to the United States Freedom of Information Act. That's a heck of a last line. Not subject to the United States Freedom of Information Act. What does that mean? Well, they're not accountable. I now discovered the lie, discovered the proof, and lo and behold, the one place that the UFO/service reports were going to, ironically, was not subject to the United States Freedom of Information Act. How rare is that? It's actually pretty rare. Anybody on the federal level when it comes to the government or military is subject to the Freedom of Information Act. I could even file a FOIA request to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. So even those installations in other countries are all subject to the FOIA. There are two examples that I can give you that are not subject to the FOIA. One of which is NORAD, because they're both control of the United States and Canada, but also the White House. The Presidential Records Act exempts presidential records until they are out of office. Then the National Archives takes over. They create their presidential library, and then all of that is FOIA fodder. Researchers like myself have a field day then going after all of those documents that were connected to the White House. Other than that, the Freedom of Information Act is fair game. You can use it wherever you'd like. Well, sadly, all of these UFO service reports were in one of those two places that I can tell you, not subject to the FOIA. Now, it took me about a year. I've talked about this a little bit on past episodes, but for the sake of being complete here, it took about a year for me to realize that this was the answer to my dilemma was in the letter that I just read to you. And it was the part that said, subject to control of both Canadian and U.S. government agencies. It took me a year to realize, what about Canada? The United States said that they're not subject to the FOIA, which, by the way, I didn't point out, in that same letter, they said in good faith they looked for documents relating to my request and found none. They did that because NORAD actually has like their own internal procedure that they follow that is in the spirit of the FOIA. So it's not U.S. law, but it is something where they process requests. So they said that they, quote unquote, in good faith, whatever that means, in good faith looked for documents, meaning service UFO reports, and found none. I didn't believe them. I mean, what are the odds? This manual was on the books and they really didn't collect one UFO document? Come on. The likelihood of that was fairly nil. But what could I do? I mean, there's nothing I could do. I then realized, what about Canada? Now, being impatient, I knew the Freedom of Information Act was U.S. law, but being impatient, I thought, well, what if Canada has some kind of equivalent to the Freedom of Information Act, which they do. It's called the Access to Information Act, or the AIA. The AIA, I was unaware if, as a U.S. citizen, I could use it. Just for your own education, if you're listening from France right now, or if you're listening from England or Russia or Japan or wherever you might be listening to outside the walls of the United States, you may not know that you can actually use the United States Freedom of Information Act. All of the government documents that I can request, you can request them too. But what I wasn't sure about was whether or not I could do an AIA request to a Canadian agency. So, did a little bit of research, figured out that the Department of National Defense, kind of their equivalent to our DOD, would be the most likely place that these service reports would go to. So I picked up the phone, being impatient, and I gave them a call. Gentleman answered the phone, and I remember this like it was yesterday. I mean, we're going on almost 2 decades, probably about 17-ish years when I made this phone call. But I called him, and a gentleman answered the phone, and so I didn't say my name. I didn't say, my name's John Greenewald, I research UFOs. I didn't say anything. I said, sir, if I could ask you a quick question, I said, can a U.S. citizen request information under the Access to Information Act? And this is the part that I remember like it was yesterday. He said, well, thinks for a moment. If the information's been released before, I don't see why not. Okay, well, great. Maybe there's no official line in Canada, but apparently this guy doesn't care if whatever I'm looking for has been released before. I said, okay, well, let me ask you something. What I'm looking for are called service reports. Service stands for Communication Instructions for Reporting, and he interrupts me in mid-sentence. He says, oh, yeah. He says, I've got those right here. I said, what? I said, I'm sorry? And he says, oh, yeah. He says, I've got them right here. I like to keep these things handy. That's what he said. Out of all the gin joints in all the world, I called the office where the guy that answers the phone for the entire Department of National Defense has UFO service reports within arm's reach. And he really literally reached out his arm and grabbed him. How do I know that? Because I heard it in his hands. And he says, I've got them right here. I was floored. I did not want to hurt any chance to get that information because it proved, I could prove that the U.S. government had, or U.S. military had, on the books, a research program. There was no program name per se, but Air Force Instruction 10-206 specifically outlined reporting UFOs, archiving that information. Obviously, that just didn't sit there and collect dust. I mean, you don't ask for things like that if you're going to do nothing with it. There was a purpose that this instruction existed. Not only now did I have that, but this gentleman on the phone was holding the information to prove NORAD was lying. Why do I know they were lying? Because by the book, all service reports have to go to NORAD. It doesn't matter if they get channeled somewhere else thereafter. But for NORAD to tell me we got nothing, that we don't collect these, that didn't make sense. And so this gentleman was holding in his hand kind of that evidence that I needed to prove all of that. That was going to create an end, finally, to my circle of going around the U.S. government and military through Canada back to me to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt there was a cover-up. Cover-up of what? We'll debate that later, but cover-up nonetheless. So I said, wow, that's great. I said, can I get a copy of those? Like, how can I get a copy of them? And he kind of thinks for another moment. He says, well, you got a Visa card? And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy's going to charge me thousands. I'm like, I think still in high school, maybe a little bit thereafter at this point. I don't have a lot of money. So I'm thinking to myself, how do I get around this? And I go, well, yes, I do have a Visa card. How much are you going to charge me? So he kind of thumbs through for a little bit. I've actually looked it up because I wanted to make sure that that the number was right for my book because it was roughly, I knew it was a couple dollars. It was actually $3.91 Canadian. Within $5, less than $5, less than $4, I was able to get the best evidence in my mind at this time that I knew existed. He charged my Visa card, and sure enough, a couple weeks later, I got that material. Before I get into that, though, the end of the conversation, he says, by the way, he says, this isn't all of them. And that made me a little speechless. I said, what? And he said, we've got boxes of these down in archives. Now, the reason why the amount was so low is he only had about 100 pages on his desk. Right? That was enough for me. I only wanted 5. That was fine. If I could prove that the Air Force was lying with a single page, I'll do it. If I've got 100 of them, even better. Now I've got boxes of them. Well, at least that's what he said. Now, these boxes of service reports were sent over to archives, but for whatever reason, the service reports that he had within arm's reach, they arrived at my mailbox. They were pretty amazing when I got it. When I opened it up, sure enough, NORAD was listed all over this place, all over these documents. So the fact that they said that they didn't collect them, they didn't have any, I'll let you figure out if they're lying, but their name was on them. So needless to say, they did have them. There was a connection between NORAD and these service reports. The other interesting part was that the fact that they were from pretty much at the time, present day. Now, again, we're going back about 18-ish years, but I mean, I'm looking at one of the documents now, 1999. So the fact that they were within a year or two from me getting them meant that it was active, that the UFO and service topic was something that was still real, that was still on the books, and this proved an active cover-up. You cannot tell me that all of these pieces of evidence show a coincidental accident, that NORAD accidentally didn't find these, that the Air Force accidentally, for decades, has sent out a fact sheet on UFOs that was completely wrong. That's not an accident. In my mind, these documents, this information, proves there's an active cover-up. However, the story takes a very interesting turn when I worked very hard to get attention to this. This is a very important story. This is something that not many people even know about, let alone talk about. So at the time, I was making my first television appearances, History Channel, Discovery Channel, and I was asked for certain documents and information, and this came up, and I said, look at this. And at the time, there was a show on History Channel called When UFOs Arrive. And the whole gist of the show was about, well, when UFOs show up, what happens? Are there procedures? What goes on? Well, I played a role in this show because I was researching that very topic. And I was able to show the only official on the books documentation that they were actively involved in UFO research. When someone or something showed up in our skies, and we couldn't figure out who it was, there were procedures on how to report it and document it, use it for intelligence purposes. This was 1947. This was not 1952. This was not 1965. This was not even 1976. We're talking about the late 1990s and beyond of UFO information that was being documented. And all of this came to me from Canada with the support of a Department of the Air Force manual that they gave to me. Now, fast forward a couple years, that show, from what I understand, was a big success and did very, very well when it came to ratings because it was real. There weren't these crazy theories that you see on a lot of these cheesy UFO shows that are out there. There's some good ones. There's a lot of good ones, actually. But, I mean, let's face it. Entertainment is not always friendly to the serious UFO world. So this particular one did good. But there wasn't a whole lot of attention to 10-206 after that. Now, fast forward, and he's been a guest on this program. We talked about it, and again, for the sake of this, it might be a little repetitive if you've been a long-time listener, but in the effort to be complete here, Lee Spiegel, who at the time worked for the Huffington Post, gave me a call. And he said, John, he says, I want to do a story. I want to highlight, the work of you in the Black Vault. And he says, can you give me like the top 5 UFO related documents that you've been able to uncover and get and that you feel are the most important? So that's a common question, and it's always difficult to answer. It doesn't get easier. But on that list of 5, in no particular order, I put 10-206, Air Force Instruction 10-206. But I said, Lee, the most interesting part is you don't need to take my word for it, because he did, after seeing that list, zero in on this 10-206 document. And I said, Lee, you don't have to take my word for it. I said, let me show you something. And I walked him through the archive of government publications or military publications. And you can actually download this thing directly from the Air Force if you knew where to look. It was not secret or anything like that. It's just really difficult, some of these military databases. So I showed him how to do that, and he was pretty fascinated because not only did I give it to him, and look, he had no reason to doubt me, but when you download it from the military, directly from a military server, it gives a whole new aura of legitimacy. It's like hiding it in plain sight. You can't get around that this active publication was on an Air Force server, the same agency that denies any interest in UFOs. Don't ask questions, just go away. But the minute you start looking, the minute you start asking, all of a sudden an Air Force manual pops up. No one had ever found this before, but I showed him how to get it. He downloads it. He does what any good investigative journalist would do. He reaches out to the Pentagon for comment. Well, there was no response. He left a message, no response. Well, I remember it quite vividly because it was fairly late here in California. And he calls me late on a Friday night. I was visiting my sister. And he says, John, you're not going to believe this. He says, I'm finishing up my story. I have no comment yet from the Pentagon, but he says, I'm finishing up my story. Of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, you're not going to believe this. I went to go download 10-206 again, whether he was fact-checking or whatever he was doing. And he says, Chapter 5 is gone. Now, I said, wait, what? I said, what are you talking about? And he says, well, Chapter 5, and again, this was Communication Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings, or SERVIS. The chapter that outlined UFOs was missing. It was rewritten, and now it dealt with hurricanes. Chapter 5 was about hurricanes. Now, he told me this on the phone, and I didn't believe it. I thought maybe he stumbled on the wrong link. He went to the wrong database, followed the wrong number. Yeah, there's 1,000 different explanations for what possibly could have happened. So I said, tell you what, let me get home, let me verify this, and I'll get back to you. Sure enough, I got home. It was really late by the time I got home, and sure enough, Air Force 10-206 was completely modified. Chapter 5, the way it was written before, was gone. UFOs was gone. Didn't appear anywhere in the manual anymore. And Chapter 5 was on hurricanes. Now, let me just squash a very skeptical response to that story. It could be possible, some may ask, that the Air Force simply overlooked this manual, that this was an older manual, that UFOs shouldn't have been in there, This was an oversight. They deleted it, and they should have, rescinded it long before I had found it, got publicity for it, and the Huffington Post was asking questions. Here is my evidence to squash that. They actively edited that publication multiple times from my discovery through the point the Huffington Post asked their question, which was, John Greenewald of the Black Vault is showing us this. You guys are stating publicly you don't have an interest to it. Can you explain it? There is no way that during those revisions, multiple revisions, that UFOs would be overlooked every single time. My answer would not be the same if I discovered the manual, it was never edited, a major mainstream media publication asked the question, and then it was changed. I would have a slightly different reaction. Because yes, that is the out. The out would be, well, this was an oversight. We don't really use this anymore. Once it was brought to our attention, we did end up revising it. No, I was able to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that 10-206 was modified multiple times with major rewrites, not just a phone number or an address or a space or a period or a comma. But I was able to prove through a Freedom of Information Act request, getting the changes that they had done over the years. In fact, I downloaded multiple copies from 2000, 2004, 2008 that had UFOs and surveys in it. During those major revisions, it never came out. Huffington Post was going to put the spotlight on it, and voila, it's gone. The publication date of this newest rendition, the one that Lee told me about, was about 48 hours, roughly, after the initial phone call by Lee Spiegel. It took them 48 hours to completely rewrite this. Was this a coincidence? I'll let you decide that, but what are the odds? What are the odds that after all of those multiple revisions, now again, I filed those FOIA requests after all this happened, when after all documents pertaining to the change of Air Force Instruction 10-206, went after that and was able to show that they never had any problem with UFOs being in there. What are the odds that then the Huffington Post goes to profile it, within 48 hours it's gone? That's not a coincidence. That's a cover-up. I was already convinced of the cover-up at this point. Cover-up of what? Again, that's debatable. We can have fun debating that. But I was convinced of the cover-up. This proved beyond shadow of a doubt they will do whatever it takes to cover it up. They will be so blatant with that cover-up that they just don't care how bad it looks. There are too many coincidences and too many issues when it comes to the UFO phenomenon that you cannot overlook. And this is one of the biggest stories that I've ever been entangled in my opinion. One of the most important that I feel deserves more attention. Because after everything that I've told you up until this point is verifiable, you can look at the documentation, show that the UFO phenomena is real. Yes, plural. Show that it's real. And, I'm going to get letters about that. You watch. I'll post them. I will get letters because people be mad that I said phenomena. It happens every time. But I digress. The UFO phenomena is real. Documents are there. The UFO procedures for investigation are there. And when people start asking questions, they cover it up. All of that is blatant, but it is black and white. UFOs are black and white in these documents and in these manuals and instructions. Now, that ends. I can't believe I'm an hour and 10 minutes. I hope that this is I hope this is beneficial for you all, because I needed to lay that historical groundwork to take you on a journey from the real history from the late 40s all the way through the 2000s to show you what that real documented history is. Now let's talk about October of 2017. I watched with great interest a press conference led by Tom DeLonge, formerly of Blink-182, the rock band. I grew up listening to him. I am a fan. Do not get me wrong. I do not talk bad about him. I don't like all of his music. But I grew up. I was a high schooler when he was at his peak. And I have always appreciated some of those songs. Not all of them, because there's some really off-the-wall ones. Sorry, Tom, but not all of them. But some of them. And so I'm a fan, right? So he gets involved in this UFO research. For those who don't know, let me lay some groundwork here. He starts making waves in the UFO community, not only with his interest, but he starts making headway into talking to people like John Podesta, which was revealed in the WikiLeaks Clinton emails and the Podesta emails and so on, that he's reaching out. He's starting to make a difference. The problem, though, is he's teasing a lot of this stuff. He's teasing the general public. Big things are coming. Big things are coming. Can't wait to big things are coming. But sadly, up until October, big things didn't come yet. There wasn't a whole lot. And so he was often ridiculed. I watched with interest. I didn't care. In fact, I don't think I ever spoke publicly about DeLonge's involvement with everything, because I had my doubts that he would do anything. And October of 2017 came around, and to my surprise, he holds this press conference with a couple other people, and one of which stuck out to me. Now, this was the announcement of To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science. This was a private corporation looking for investors like you and me to invest in a grander picture. And that grander picture was a couple different levels. He had an entertainment division of To the Stars Academy, which I'll now just reference as TTSA. So he had an entertainment division of TTSA. He had an aerospace division of TTSA. His books, Tom DeLonge started writing quite a few different books. That was all connected. So it was a very big effort for him to kind of bring all this together, create a investment campaign for TTSA. He called it a public benefit corporation. I'll be honest with you, I don't really know a whole lot about what the legality is when you have an S Corp, a C Corp, or a public benefit corp, or whatever you want to call it. He was trying to profit no matter what. And this isn't a non-profit, obviously. So public benefit, I'm not real sure what the real definition is of that. That aside, he was looking to raise, he along with Dr. Hal Puthoff, Steve Justice, and this man by the name of, that's not everybody, I'm just, again, just summarizing here quickly, but I want to hone in on Luis Elizondo, who was one that stood in front of everybody. And their effort was to show what TTSA was all about and ask you and I for money. How much money? They looked to raise $50 million. That $50 million would be invested in those divisions that I just mentioned to you, and they would essentially grow. Aerospace division would create anti-gravity aircraft or spacecraft or whatever he wanted to do. Entertainment division would make movies and documentaries and so on. Of course, that's the impression I get. What they were really trying to aim for, I mean, of course, they're going to have details that they didn't release to the public, but that ultimately was the public perception of what they were doing. Luis Elizondo gets up to the microphone, and I was watching it live. I was working on another unrelated project at my computer, and I have a couple different monitors on my system, and so I'm streaming it on one monitor, working on the other. I had no idea that this man would stand up, and he would say that he headed a secret Pentagon UFO study, that he was in charge of something that was looking into the UFO phenomena. Now, I was floored. I honestly was, because it was fascinating to me. I was eager to see exactly what he was going to say. Now, at the time, in October, there was no program name. He was just talking about this UFO study. And now I was intrigued by this immediately, so I stopped what I was doing. I filed FOIA requests to the Department of Defense because he had mentioned that. Mr. Elizondo had only referenced this program as, quote, a sensitive aerospace threat identification program. That's all he said. He also called it DoD Aerospace Threat Program, which then that's what some of the media outlets were quoting him as saying. So AATIP had not been revealed yet. That's kind of the bigger story, but that doesn't come around until December. So I immediately filed a FOIA request to the DoD. And I specifically mentioned Mr. Elizondo, specifically mentioned his testimony that this program existed. Now, under the FOIA, you can ask for stuff like that as long as you have even though I don't have a program name, I had a man who was speaking publicly. I had his name and his testimony. If he was lying, well, then I'm not going to get very far. If he wasn't lying, then hopefully the FOIA request would bear something out. So I filed this FOIA request, and in, let me see, November 27th, 2017, I got a response. Now, in the interim, from October to the end of November, I had tried to figure out where Mr. Elizondo had worked. And within the Department of Defense, specifically what they call OSD, or the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Now, from what I am led to believe by the PR agent at TTSA, and then subsequently I changed my FOIA request, he worked for the Office for the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, or OUSDI. Now, OSD has multiple components to it, and this is a radio show in itself, but under the FOIA, if you do something to the DoD, do a FOIA request to the DoD, if it's an Air Force project, they'll send it to the Air Force. If a Navy project, send it to the Navy. All part of the Department of Defense. But there's multiple components to the tune of like 25 or 30. I don't know the exact number, but there's many components underneath OSD that, could potentially have records. Well, they can't do a search on all of the components. They refuse to do that. It's what they call too burdensome. And so I had to figure out what component that he worked with. And that was one of the only responses with substance that I got from TTSA, and I'll talk about more. But OUSDI was where Mr. Elizondo allegedly worked. And so I said, I'll amend my request for documents on this. But I do want to figure out, what component, if it wasn't OUSDI, where was this program? So we go back and forth, but here's the final decision from the DoD. And they state, and again, they heard Mr. Elizondo's testimony. They saw my links to multiple media articles because the Huffington Post had covered it at this point, a few other places. So this was not me like making up stuff, hopefully throwing it against the wall to see what stuck. There was evidence to go along with what I was requesting. They say, after thorough searches of electronic records and files of OUSDI, no records of the kind you described could be identified. We believe that these search methods were appropriate and could reasonably be expected to produce the requested records if they existed. They denied that any documents pertaining to anything that Mr. Elizondo was talking about existed. Now, I went from excited to really confused at this point because I thought, wait a minute, that's kind of a red flag. Because, number one, he's talking about this openly. In the world of government secrecy, you can't just go out and start talking about stuff that's classified. Not without repercussions. Look at what Edward Snowden went through. Now, that's different, right? It's not UFO related, but it's secrecy related. And he starts, leaking information, blowing the whistle, talking about classified material. Well, where is he? He's holed up in some other country with asylum because the government comes after you. You can't just do that. So that's proof. That's that evidence that you can call back on and prove or disprove something. So this man is standing up. He's talking about this program, and the same office he claims he worked at just said, nope, sorry, we got nothing. There's no records on this. Are they lying? What's going on? I put forward three at the time, at the end of November. I put forward three possibilities. The DOD was lying, which, hey, look, I've proven that time and time again. So whether or not that's the reality at this point, that was top of my list. That they were just downright not telling me the truth. Second point I put out there, the program was being blown out of proportion. Well, that's one that I feel is definitely a huge possibility. Maybe it wasn't a UFO research program. Maybe there was a UFO research element to it. It's quite possible that Mr. Elizondo was lying. It's quite possible that he was giving out misinformation. It's possible he made it all up just to get $50 million of your dollars. As much as we don't want to think it's a cash grab, sorry, when $50 million is involved, that is a possibility. I also put down the fact that the DOD quite possibly just didn't have an outline or a mission statement or any objective or anything in regards to what this program was. Incredibly unlikely, because and why I say it that way, that really was specific documents named in my request. Because when you do file a FOIA request and you say, well, give me everything you've got on Project Blue Book. Well, we know that there are like literally 50, 60, 70,000 pages that are left over from that program. So they can't just go and photocopy it at what they call too burdensome. So you got to round it down. The likelihood of a program like this existing that did not have an outline, a mission statement, a list of objectives, or anything related to that would be very, very unlikely. So that's why when I request for something, specifically on this program, again, didn't have AATIP yet, that didn't break till December, that was all I could request. And yet they say, nope, sorry, we've got nothing. So I appealed that no records response, and I appealed based on the fact that I had a guy going on the record. Now, I don't really talk about it that much, and I'm apprehensive now, but I'll bring it up. In one of my telephone conversations with the DOD at the time, they said over the telephone that they could not verify where Mr. Elizondo had worked, what component. This was in the course of one of my conversations with them. Now that I'm going to defend what that sounds like here, but I'm bringing it up for a reason. I'm defending that impression you're probably getting, like, oh my gosh, he's lying about even working there, let alone this program. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that out of the 25, 35, whatever amount of components that the DOD has, or OSD, out of all of those components, they couldn't figure out where this guy worked, even based on the testimony, even based on the description of the program. Now, I was talking to the press office, and word was already spreading about this program because people were asking questions, people much bigger than me. The Huffington Post, the MSNBCs, the Washington Post, they started kind of getting interested through the end of November and into December. Wasn't real big, but there was enough interest that they knew what was going on, but they told me over the telephone that they could not figure out where he even worked. Now, once I was able to verify with TTSA over time that he worked at that particular component with OUSDI, then, it was like, okay, well, they kind of found it, but they still had that. I lost the FOIA request and the appeal. They said no records, that there was nothing. So now fast forward to December, right? So that set up a lot of red flags for me. One of the big ones was what was the reason for that no records response? Regardless of not having that program name, there was still enough evidence in there for them to track down documents. There just was. So fast forward now to December, and the New York Times releases was the big one. There was a couple, but the New York Times releases one of the main articles on Mr. Elizondo, and now we have a name, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. So I'm thinking, well, okay, so now I've got a program name. So now the story really breaks. Now it really starts to get attention, really starts to get out there. New York Times was one of the first. It then was covered in, I don't know how many countries, like every country that has a newspaper, I'm sure they covered it somehow. It was huge. It was big news that Mr. Elizondo was out there talking about a secret Pentagon UFO study. Now, what's the problem, though? The component, OSD, the office that he claims he works at, said, yeah, we don't really have any records on it. Well, now I've got a program name. So I file again. And finally, I was able to get some kind of segue. They said, well, again, paraphrasing, but they said that anything in regards to AATIP was going to be processed by the Defense Intelligence Agency, or the DIA. Now, this also was reported by the mainstream media, so this was nothing new. The DIA was involved. But here's one of the very odd other red flags that immediately came up. I had picked up the phone and called the office for the spokesperson of the Pentagon. We're not talking about a paper pusher here. We're not talking about somebody who doesn't know. This is the office that goes on the record to talk about all of this information, whether it be about AATIP or anything else related to the Pentagon or the DoD. Like, this is that office. When you hear about press statements and quotes, when you're watching your CNNs and Fox Newses of the world, this is the office that gives it. So I picked up the telephone. I've worked with them before through my work in television, behind the scenes, and picked up the telephone. Didn't know the very nice lady who originally answered, but she was part of the office. And I said, can you tell me, I'm looking for any information on AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Yes, I said aerospace. And she says, she says, no, you mean the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program. So she knew exactly what I was talking about. She corrected me. And I go, aviation? I said, okay. I said, I'll be honest with you. I think it's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. I wasn't trying to educate her. I'm just going by what I read in the media. And I fell for one of the biggest things that I've said before, and I'll say it again. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And I caught myself when I said it. Well, I've been reading, New York Times and a couple other newspaper articles that were out there, and they all say aerospace. And she goes, nope. And she said it just like that. Nope. It's Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, AATIP. You mean AATIP? And she kept saying AATIP. It was the first time I've ever heard that acronym, right? So this is going back in December. I don't know who first talked about the pronunciation of the acronym, because sometimes people say AATIP and so on. The military was very adamant it was aviation, and it was AATIP. Okay, great. Can you tell me anything about it? Well, the person you got to talk to is Major Audricia Harris. I said, okay, perfect. So I worked my way to her, got her on the phone. She was very, very sweet. I got nothing bad to say about my experience talking to the Pentagon, the DoD. Of course, they only have their approved lines, which a lot you see in the various articles that came about. But another story started to emerge. Not only was the name wrong, as being touted by some of these media agencies, but the other thing was the gist of the story was wrong. That it wasn't a UFO secret program, that it was something else. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I mean, UFO is UFO. It doesn't mean alien. So why wouldn't they admit to this? This guy's out there. He's talking about all this. And the Pentagon is going on the record stating, no, I think the DIA's office was the one that added this part. But they said that this is just being embellished. That this program was not the secret UFO study that everybody thought. And Major Harris tells me on the telephone that the name was in fact aviation, which I later got in writing. So there's no getting out of that. Nobody can say that this is hearsay. I have it in writing. So she said, it is aviation. And she said, no, this was not necessarily the UFO research program that was being touted about. So, I mean, I'm not going to timestamp every conversation, but through the course of weeks, I had multiple conversations with her over the telephone and via email. Now, I'll focus on the ones that came in through email because I can prove that. I can back it up. I don't play the whole someone told me in a back alley something. I have no proof. I won't tell you exactly what they said, but it's true. I don't do that. And there are people that do that out there, especially in this field. And it's really sad and frustrating, to be honest with you, because you never know. You never know what's real anymore, right? So I focus in on what is in writing. Now, obviously, the red flags came up with the name itself. Obviously, the red flags came up with the scope of what AATIP was all about. But then I asked Major Harris specifically about the videos. Now, if you followed this from day one, you know that they have now, over time have released 3 videos total. And these are infrared videos showing a UFO. The most popular is the USS Nimitz video. There's really no context other than that. And they're claiming that this is part of AATIP and this is showing something extraordinary. Are they interesting? Absolutely. But I was interested to see, like, what is the context? And when you watch these videos, you know that they're edited. And I say that because you've got the TTSA logo, you've got the fade-ins, the fade-outs, dip to black, come up from black. What I mean by that is they've obviously taken a source, an original video of something, edited it, and they put it out there and they released it. So obviously you've already tainted the evidence, so to speak. Do they have the originals? I'm sure they do. But my whole point is that was what I had noticed first, was that there was some editing involved. I'm not going to fault them for that. Even I, try and put a title slate or something like that. But I never edit the actual video. When I get a video under the Freedom of Information Act and the military, the government, they all, send it to me. I don't do anything with it, meaning cut it out or cut off the first 3 minutes or the last 5 minutes or just lift out the middle and show you. I show the whole thing. So that was a red flag to me. Maybe not necessarily a red flag, but a concern, because I want to see that raw video. What happened beforehand when this object appeared? So I asked her specifically about these videos, and she said that they did not release these videos. And what I mean by that is that the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, this is the official spokesperson for the Pentagon. I'm trying to, stress that, because we're not talking about somebody just sending me an email. I mean, this is an official line. She says, we did not release those videos. Now, why would she say something like that? Now, I've proven many, many lies when it comes to the military and the government many times before. And the reason I bring that up is because generally you don't have such a statement when they put their weight behind something in writing. Generally, when you prove a lie, you're kind of not necessarily reading between the lines, but it's not like this. This is a little bit different. Could they still be lying? Of course. I would never say that is not a possibility. However, she says that they never released those videos. They were not officially declassified. Now, that is a big concern for me, because now you've got in writing the Pentagon stating, hey, we didn't do it. We did not release or declassify these videos. Now, I'm not saying the videos are fake. In fact, I actually think they're real. I've said on many occasions, and I'll say it again now, if there was any, not hoaxing, but any falsehood behind it, I think the audio it may come out that that audio is not the original. Now, the reason I say that is there's just a lot that sticks out to me, that the pilots, the way they're talking on an open channel like that, and it's not just the one video, it just seemingly like all of them have these expletives and dropping the F-bomb and this and that. I'm not saying the military personnel are always clean with their language, just something seemed a little bit off. Now, that's just a gut feeling. There's no fact, I got nothing to tell you that they definitely doctored that audio. But I will say that it sticks out to me. So that being said, that was something that was really of a big concern, because now they're putting it in writing that they did not release those videos, that they did not have any role in that. So now the question is, where did they come from? So as you research this, Mr. Elizondo has addressed that criticism, whether it be because he read what I have said, or I'm not the only one. There are quite other people that have asked this question. But Mr. Elizondo said that he filed a DD Form 1910. And the DD Form 1910, what that essentially is instead of doing a FOIA request like someone like you or me, somebody on the inside can file a DD Form 1910 that requests something either unclassified but for official use only, or something classified, submits it to get it declassified, so reviewed for release. This is what I learned from Major Harris, because I'm not an expert on DD Form 1910s. It's called the DOPSR process. Have I heard of it? Of course, but there's a lot of legal, it's a lot of legal jargon that goes behind stuff like this. So Mr. Elizondo said that he filed the DD Form 1910. The DOPSR process was completed, and that's how these videos came to be. Well, this is what I learned from Major Harris. Let's just say all that is true. She did not confirm that. But let's just say that was true. Just because the DOPSR process was completed, and let's just say that they did authorize that be declassified, that does not authorize the release. So there's an extra step that seemingly has been skipped. So let's just assume they're real, because I actually do believe they're real. Okay, so I'm not trying to say they're not. So they're real videos. A step was missed in the DOPSR process. So now, Mr. Elizondo comes out with them. He releases them through the TTSA website. Now what? Does the government go after him and say, hey, look, Mr. Elizondo, we're charging you with, whatever a violation he did, or they're not classified videos. There's nothing on there that shows that they were, secret or top secret videos. They looked unclassified. And the reason I say that is because generally when you do look at videos that are classified, even the declassified ones, they do have some kind of slate or title slate that claims that they are, that shows that they are, not claims, but that shows this was secret or top secret, but obviously has been declassified. So the government and military puts those slates on there. Obviously, they were cut out if they were legitimately released. So now we have another red flag. So DOD says, no, we didn't release these videos. Elizondo said, yes, they did through the DOPSR process. And the Pentagon, and for the record, Mr. Elizondo did not say that to me directly. I believe he's said this in, various ways through either like a written statement or articles, but he's known to respond to this. So now you have kind of an issue here on the Pentagon responding to this entire thing, saying that the DOPSR process still has another step that then authorizes the release to the general public. So all of this is negating what Mr. Elizondo is stating, and that is a big, in my opinion, a big deal. Now, the one thing that I think everyone needs to know and realize, because it's very quick to say, well, the government's lying, the military's lying, Mr. Elizondo's telling the truth. Not necessarily. I mean, sadly, we've as investigators and I speak for myself here, but as an investigator, you have to look at all possibilities. And it is possible that he is just not telling the truth. So when I got all of this information from Major Harris, I thought, okay, look, there are way too many red flags not to question it. Not to reach out to TTSA and say, what do you say to this? Now the Pentagon has actually responded to everything that you have come out with and has shot down that you are being truthful. So what are you going to say? So I did that. I reached out to TTSA. I tried to contact the public affairs, public relations person over there, Carrie DeLong, which happens to be Tom DeLong's sister. She was the one that was, doing a lot of the PR reach out. I believe they have a different PR agency now, but I haven't even bothered to push this, but I tried to reach out and just say, hey, look, if there's a way to prove that the government is lying, I'm all over this because I've done it many times over. Let's do this. Let's prove this together. And the reason why I say that is because I have an avenue for them to release this information. Obviously, they didn't give it to the New York Times, or so the legend goes. They showed that the DOD declassified this footage. And they did that by what they call a chain of evidence document. Now, it always struck me as weird because the New York Times didn't publish anything about that. Why would you not? Now, let's say they saw it behind the scenes. Well, let's kind of push forward a little bit. The reason why I reached out was I said, look, I run this government archive. I've made a living out of, catching the government in lies and researching UFO information and research projects and so on. If you have this information, let's do it. I wanted to do an interview with Mr. Elizondo. I waited until after the avalanche of media publicity that they got because I thought, sadly, I was mistaken, but I thought maybe they would actually want an avenue, a fair avenue for them to respond to the government saying that they were essentially lying. They didn't say he was lying, but pretty much what he said was all dismissed as not being true. So, fill in the blank. So I thought that this would be a good avenue for them. And for 4 months, I waited, going back and forth with the public relations person, but 4 months getting strung along. Well, I'm really pushing for this. I'm advocating. This was an exact quote, advocating for this to take place. So I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, and 4 months goes by. Meanwhile, I'm seeing other interviews, other podcasts, and other reference to this chain of custody document. Now, I bring up the chain of custody document because this is, according to them, the proof that they have that proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that the government released this information and that they declassified these videos and released them. I've done over 9,000 Freedom of Information Act requests in 22 years. I've gone after some of the most highly classified material that's within the government. In a lot of cases, I can actually show you guys documents that had never been out before. Never once, not a single time, have I ever seen a, quote, chain of custody document when it comes to records being declassified. Ever. Now, there are routing and transmittal slips. And what those are, and I get them all the time. I'm not military. I'm not government. I don't have a clearance. But I get these all the time when the U.S. government or military declassifies something. The National Security Agency is a prime example. When I go after documents that have never been released before, they declassify them and submit them to me. They send them to me through the mail. On top of my letter is a transmittal slip. And that shows me and shows anybody who grabs a hold of that envelope until it gets put into the postal mail that the information within is declassified or unclassified, meaning it was classified secret but now declassified. And there is a signature on it that's authorizing the fact that it is unclassified material. That's not chain of custody, not even in the slightest. But it does show that information is unclassified or has been declassified. If that is what they have, there is zero reason not to release it. However, they refuse to do so. And that's what I started to learn the hard way. Is here I was trying to offer them some kind of an avenue to address not only these questions, but release that document, that evidence, to prove that the government is not being truthful. Somebody's integrity and their honesty and their character is being attacked, with the Pentagon's spokespeople saying, no, what they're saying is not true. You would think that you would want to address that, right? But instead, they refuse to show it. Now, I've seen recently in the last month or two that one person connected to TTSA by the name of Dr. Eric Davis, he's trying to say that they don't release it and it'll probably never be seen because of sources and methods, what they call sources and methods. Now, here's a quick explanation of what that means, because that is an accurate term. Sources and methods means that if you get intelligence from, let's say, Russia or China or Iran or wherever, where that intelligence comes from is sometimes classified. Sometimes the information you get is not necessarily classified, but for sources and methods reasons, they withhold it because the release of that information will then give up their source, and that source is protected. If you have a document that says that, it's classified. You would never have it in the private sector, even if you had the highest secrecy clearance that the military or government could give you. You wouldn't be able to just take it home in your briefcase, or when you retire, just keep it as a souvenir. So the fact that Dr. Davis is saying that there's sources and methods on this is absolutely ridiculous. On top of, and inaccurate, but that's his response to the internet world. And a lot of people believe that. Why? Well, because he says it as fact. Sadly, it's not fact. And that is yet another red flag where they are disseminating this false information that isn't true. And so I posted on, various articles and so on, and Dr. Davis refuses to respond to me, which is fine. But sadly, I think that he owes it to the public that he is disseminating this information to respond, to say whether or not I'm wrong. I've never, ever, in 2 million pages out of those 9,000 plus FOIA requests, seen what they're talking about. So show it. But if they claim that it's classified, or they claim that it's sources and methods, which means that it would be classified, they wouldn't have it. So there's two ways to look at it. If what Dr. Davis is saying is partially true and it's sources and methods, so whatever document they have would, reveal something classified, that means they don't have it. Why? Well, because it's classified. Again, just a friendly reminder, with a security oath, it doesn't matter. The minute you retire, you have to give up all that information. You can't keep it home as a souvenir. So what Dr. Davis obviously proved was, number one, that they've been lying that they have the document in the first place, or number two, he's making it up to make it sound really good, but they just don't have what they're talking about. There's no possible way at all. And you can quote me on that, you can write them directly, but there is no possible way that they would have that information. If they do have something, it would not have sources and methods on it. It just wouldn't. So I don't buy for a second that they have that chain of evidence document, but if they have something similar, like a routing and transmittal slip, those are not classified. You can download them on my website at theblackvault.com. The signatures and the names of the person who sent me that unclassified information is on there. There's no reason to withhold that. Not for me. Not for anyone. It's a part of public record. So honestly, those types of explanations, that type of information is wrong. And it's downright misleading. And it is just yet another thing to tack on to the list. So let's get beyond what I call the official word, because those are the only official words from the Pentagon about AATIP. So let me quickly summarize. The name is wrong. Well, according to the Pentagon anyway. Are they lying? Possibly. Mr. Elizondo has stayed firm that it is aerospace and not aviation. The Pentagon put it in writing, and they will not waver from what they are saying. So somebody's wrong. Somebody's making it up. On top of that, the general gist of AATIP, according to Mr. Elizondo, was some kind of secret Pentagon UFO study. The Pentagon says, nope, that's blown out of proportion. The Defense Intelligence Agency says, nope, this is getting really embellished. And yet Mr. Elizondo stays firm. So does the government. Obviously, somebody's lying. Mr. Elizondo said that they released those videos. TTSA said they released those videos, meaning the government and the military. They're officially declassified. Problem is, Pentagon says, no, we didn't. They put it in writing. Obviously, somebody's wrong. Somebody's lying. Somebody's making it up. Only one of the two sides, however, says that they have evidence to prove it, but they won't show you. TTSA claims they have that chain of evidence document, and sadly, they won't show it. So I think that in itself are huge red flags. Now, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as I mentioned, is going to be what they call the OPR, the Office of Primary Responsibility, for the declassification of everything related to AATIP. Now, what does all that mean? The OPR means, an OPR means that when you have, let's say, a CIA project, and they're working with the Army, and they send the Army one of their reports just to either update them or, and again, I'm making this scenario up, but let's just say they sent them some type of a report. If I file a FOIA request to the Army for that report, they are not what's called the OPR. Why? Because it's a CIA report. So what they do under the FOIA is they'll take my letter, forward it over to the CIA, or they'll just tell me CIA is the OPR, so you're going to have to send your request to them, one of the two. And you have to go to that source agency to get all that information declassified or reviewed for declassification. With AATIP, with the Pentagon going on the record saying the DIA was, again, that OPR for anything related to AATIP, that then puts all the FOIA requests, no matter where you send them to, they get funneled into DIA. The huge problem that I think a lot of people are overlooking here, which is really not sitting well with me, is that AATIP now is on the record, documented in FOIA response letters as being a Defense Intelligence Agency project. Now, we knew that. Even the original source article said that. But the DIA is the OPR. Mr. Elizondo didn't work for DIA. He was DOD, Department of Defense, and I know that this might get a little convoluted and confusing, but, I mean, we have to look at it. Department of Defense is a big umbrella agency where you've got all these different subcomponents and sub-agencies and agencies and so on. National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of the Army, the Navy, that's all DOD. You are not necessarily going to head a DIA project from OSD. It doesn't make sense. Overlook it and maybe, you know what, I'm not even going to make it up. I don't buy it. When you head a project that is DIA run, you're generally going to be working for DIA. When you're in charge of a CIA program, you're not doing it from the NSA. If it's a joint project, meaning it's a CIA and NSA run whatever, sure, maybe, okay, we can cross that bridge. But not in a situation like this. Now, one of the many comments that comes my way in regards to all of this is the fact that, well, according to the New York Times and Politico and so on, the money, the $22 million, went to Bigelow Aerospace. Now, we don't have confirmation of that, but let's just say that that's true. A lot of people say you're never going to find anything under FOIA because it's all private sector. And they're doing this to shield themselves from the Freedom of Information Act. Nothing makes me more frustrated to hear that. And the reason is it's just downright not true. What I will say that's true about it is, yes, there will be some things that will not be what I call FOIA-able. And what I mean by that is I can't do a FOIA request and get all of Bigelow Aerospace's emails and all of their internal communications. But here's how a military and government contract works. When you bid on something for 10 million, 50 million, a billion, whatever dollar amount it is, that's not a grant. That's a contract. And according to any contract, you are going to have to make a long laundry list of deliverables, whether that be in the form of reports, quarterly reports, annual reports, weekly reports, schematics, blueprints, final products, fill in the blanks. There's going to be a long laundry list of things that you have to do in order to secure that $22 million or the $100 million or the $150 billion, whatever it might be. You need to do those deliverables. And so to say that all of this is hidden in the private sector is completely wrong, because everything that you deliver, everything is FOIA-able. You also have all of the communications, because you don't give, like, let's say, a Lockheed Martin a contract and just hope for the best that they give you the aircraft that you just bought. There's a lot of communication that goes by in addition to all those deliverables, but a lot of communication, a lot of emails, a lot of letters, a lot of memos, all of that. All of that is FOIA-able. You cannot get around it. I'll prove it to you. I was able to get Bigelow Aerospace emails that were to and from the FAA all through the FOIA. Now, these are Bigelow Aerospace emails. The reason is because Bigelow Aerospace was tied in and mentioned in multiple FAA manuals on being the receiving end of UFO cases and information. Before that, it was BASS. Now, how can one side be telling you the truth when the other side, my side, the FOIA side, shows you emails from Bigelow Aerospace? Both can't be true. Yet under FOIA, I got Bigelow Aerospace emails. So my whole point is that you can say that they're trying to circumvent the FOIA, but you just can't, because it isn't true. So now you have that kind of blown out of the water, so to speak. If DIA was running AATIP, for me, Mr. Elizondo is not going to be doing it from OSD. It doesn't make sense. Now, if he was the OSD contact and he was, kind of the receiving end of updates and stuff like that, sure. But if you listen to Mr. Elizondo's interviews, that has nothing to do with what he did there. It was like he said in one interview, they say all roads lead to Rome, and in this case, Rome was ultimately his desk. Well, that means that everything went to him. That's what he wants you to believe. Well, which is fine. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm just saying none of that makes sense. From the official word and the documentation to what he says, if you think logically and you look at history and you see how these things really are, they don't make sense. I really wish that Mr. Elizondo said, we were doing this other project, whatever it may be, and in the process saw UFO cases and UFO information that we felt deserved a closer look. I could buy that. I could actually believe that. But sadly, he's saying that this project was looking specifically at UFO cases and collecting UFO cases, but there's really no information to support that. I'll give you more information on what I mean. He says that they were getting information from the Department of the Navy and Air Force and all these various, all of these various installations of getting the videos, and then they were analyzing them under AATIP at OSD. So I filed, the Navy was one of them that he had mentioned. So I filed a FOIA request to the Department of the Navy. And I asked for any and all communications between any component of the Department of the Navy and OSD or DIA or whomever through the AATIP program, wherein, in plain English, I was looking for those communications when they submitted a video over to AATIP, sent something over of interest. I wanted the record of that. And yes, you can request that under FOIA. And yes, I have examples where you can get those types of communications. And the Department of Navy responded They said no records. What that meant was they never had any communication with the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, or OSD, DIA, or anyone else in regards to AATIP. So where did those Navy videos come from? That's my whole point here, in that one side, Mr. Elizondo, is saying, we got them from the Navy. The Navy, under the FOIA, in writing, says, yeah, no, we never had any communication whatsoever. Stuff like that is not only done over the telephone, and they digitally send something and there's no record whatsoever. No, that the likelihood of that is nil. So now you have yet another denial. You've heard a lot about the Intellipedia system. Here's another system, and an odd occurrence when I was researching this, in the beginning days anyway. The Intellipedia system, for those who aren't aware or haven't listened to this program before, Intellipedia is like the Wikipedia of the intelligence community. In short, it's built on the same system, on a wiki system. And there are literally millions of pages of information within the Intellipedia system. That was one of my biggest triumphs when I was researching Intellipedia. It took an appeal, and I made a fight for getting the statistics page declassified, because they actually refused to tell you how big the system was. That had never been out before, and I was able to get it declassified, and it revealed millions of pages on 3 different systems. So Intellipedia comprises of a top secret, secret, and unclassified but for official use only system. So there's 3 levels. You can request under FOIA, pick something, pick any topic, even right down to world leaders, countries, project names, history, anything. Request a search of the Intellipedia system. The NSA is the one that runs it. Sometimes they have to forward the request out, but you get the information sometimes. Other times it's classified, but you can get the information. So I filed a FOIA request for any and all entries that had mentioned the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program or Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. I used both terms to be safe, because we still don't know who's right and who's wrong. So sadly, that just means that I have to, use both definitions of the acronym plus the acronym itself. Originally, the NSA told me that not one out of the millions and millions of pages mentioned AATIP or either variation of the acronym definition. So not one. Now, why is this strange? Well, pretty much anything that you request is mentioned in there somewhere. And I have hundreds of entries declassified from that system, stuff I never even thought would be in there, that were in there. So if this was an important project, why wouldn't it be named in there? Why wouldn't it have some kind of reference? And yet it didn't have a single one. Now that struck me as really strange. Now fast forward a little bit. I'm jumping around a little chronologically, but I'm trying to kind of cover a lot of bases here on what has come out. Now fast forward, I had done a different FOIA request, and in that response, it had came up with the UFO page in Intellipedia, and I had already received this declassified before. There was never a mention of AATIP in it, nor was there in December when I had requested this after this story broke. But sometime between December and the next couple of months, the UFO page was updated to include information about AATIP. So when my first FOIA request went in that got the denial, no one in the entire intelligence community thought that it was necessary to put any reference into AATIP in. Keep in mind that there is a top secret level, so don't dismiss that fact as being not important because AATIP could be classified and no one could have known about it. It doesn't work that way. The Intellipedia authors have the highest clearances you can have. There is a top secret Intellipedia system for a reason. So you can't just walk in and digitally surf that Intellipedia system if you're nobody. You obviously have to have clearances. So I was surprised that the UFO page was updated, and now it contained information about AATIP. This is, at the recording of this episode, the only document, not a letter, but the only document released under the FOIA that mentions AATIP. Now, I'm stressing released under the FOIA because there's quote-unquote leaked documents. I'm not interested really in those. They're hard to prove, at least for now. This is the only one released under FOIA. Here's what some people will hate me over, but don't kill the messenger. AATIP, Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program. Aviation. This is an official document, so what the author that put this into the Intellipedia system defines it as aviation. That completely contradicts Mr. Elizondo and TTSA. Now, here's why I don't think it was a mistake and it was intentional. The majority of the information in the couple paragraphs that now exist on the UFO page, it cites the New York Times. The New York Times article, which was titled Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program, it references AATIP as aerospace. Remember that phone call when I first called and they corrected me over the telephone and they said, no, it's aviation? It was because of me reading the New York Times article. So it said aerospace, yet they corrected me. Now, the author who cites that specific article that says aerospace changed it to aviation. In my opinion, the reason he did that or she did that is because that's the right program name. There's no other reason. When you cite a source and the source says X, you don't cite that source and say Y. You know what I mean? You don't change the source. I mean, if that's the source, then that's the source. Then you source that name and it's aerospace. But I believe that if the source is wrong, you can source some of that information about AATIP to the New York Times article. But when it comes to the title itself, they put aviation. So they obviously changed that for a reason. So I think that was further evidence to support that Mr. Elizondo is wrong and that the DOD is not lying, that they're not making it up to discredit him. And one of the things I haven't mentioned is when you put your name to something in writing, like the Pentagon is doing with me, and they say the program name is Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, documents will come out eventually, right? There's no lock and key here where this stuff is gone forever. They know it will be maybe a year, maybe 2, heck, maybe even 5. Doesn't matter. It's going to come out eventually. So for them to really stress the fact that he's got the name wrong, they're taking a huge gamble here if he really is wrong. They're taking a huge gamble here if he really is right. Because eventually then they will have the mud on their face. But there's only one side talking right now. One side claims evidence, but he denies it. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that official document, it is official, comes from the top secret program, it's top secret version, I should say, of the Intellipedia system. And for whatever reason, they decided to change it to aviation. So take that as you will. Some of the other things that have come up, some fans of TTSA are citing leaked documents. Now, my friend, Mr. George Knapp, is largely credited for getting these documents out. Now, I am not saying they are fake. Please let me stress that. In fact, I do believe that they would actually be real. One of which was a Tic Tac UFO analysis document. This was like an executive summary document that really kind of outlined what happened in regards to the USS Nimitz encounter and what they call the Tic Tac that tied into one of the videos that was released. I was called by a couple different news agencies to look at this document because it was considered or kind of displayed to the public as being a official Pentagon report or DOD document. So I was called to kind of analyze it in the sense that I've seen enough pages to know what a document looks like and what one does not look like. This did not look like official at all. I'm not saying that it's fake. What the document says was it broke down all of the information, citing even Wikipedia as a source. Wikipedia, not Intellipedia. Wikipedia. The problem with using Wikipedia as a source is the government very rarely does that. Wikipedia, although is very accurate for you and I and some of the things that you and I might do, when it comes to a government report, generally they do not use Wikipedia. I'm sure there are examples. In fact, I know there are examples where they do, but it's very, very rare. They used Wikipedia throughout this entire thing. That was a red flag in regards to supporting this was official versus just a document. The other thing was there's no classification markings. Any government document created, either by the military or the government, is going to have some kind of classification designation, even if it's unclassified. So none of that fit into this document at all. What I think we have here is probably a real document. Probably came from Bigelow Aerospace, but was not part of AATIP, was not official. Interesting, sure, but it doesn't mean anything. So I think that can largely be dismissed as anything official. So before I go off and get into like a 12-hour show here, I mean, there have been other leaked documents that I don't necessarily want to say I doubt their legitimacy, meaning I do believe they are probably real on some level. The problem is to an investigator, you can't really use leaked information until things become concrete. I will say that Senator Harry Reid, former Senator Harry Reid, who was responsible for getting the funding for AATIP, he has gone on the record and said about 80% of information relating to this program is unclassified. He said that. So why would there be such secrecy behind Mr. Elizondo and those tied to him stating, this is a big secret, we need to maintain that secrecy? They are making decisions that the United States government and the military should make. Sadly, I think egos are getting in the way where people like Dr. Davis trying to, give the reasons on why they're not releasing some of this information is because they are making the decision on what is sources and methods and what is not. It doesn't work that way. So with those leaked documents, yes, they're interesting, and yes, they can be used to create and formulate more additional FOIA requests. Sadly, though, they are leaked documents, so I don't have a whole lot of value in them yet. Now, before I end this, I want to talk about one other thing that, again, many people I don't think are looking at. And that is a controversy behind what AATIP really was and where it came from. If you've followed what I've said, I've actually defended Mr. Elizondo on this, that he did not bring forth this other program name, which was the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. This is believed to have been the actual original name for what ultimately became AATIP back in 2008 when they were soliciting bids. According to former Senator Harry Reid, Bigelow Aerospace just happened to submit a bid, won the contract, and that's how they got their connection to AATIP. Now, I've been often ridiculed because I've brought up that Senator Harry Reid, that one that was primarily responsible for getting funding for AATIP, happens to have been the senator from the great state of Nevada, which just happens to be headquarters for Bigelow Aerospace. So obviously a contract where you've got tens of millions of dollars allegedly going to the private sector, all the more benefit if it's your state. Yes, that's not a very popular thing to say, but you need to say it nonetheless, because when you actually look into donations and so on, Mr. Bigelow has actually donated quite a bit to Senator Harry Reid's former campaigns and past campaigns. It'd be silly not to bring that up, because when you research things, you got to look at all possible angles. Was the government really trying to push this into the private sector, or Was it just by chance that Bigelow Aerospace had bid for this and got it? Was there a little bit of back scratching here? Who knows? But I think you do have to look at that reality. Now, when you look at OSAP, where I defended Mr. Elizondo was that some of the criticism was, well, why didn't he bring this up? Why didn't he talk about this name? And my first reaction to that was defending him, saying, well, why, look, if he didn't come in until after AATIP was kind of born out of OSAP, and he was in charge of that, I mean, he doesn't have to give the whole world history of the world narrative of how everything came about. If what was important was AATIP, then cool. I mean, then let's just focus on that. Let's just not, chastise the poor guy for, everything that he didn't say. I mean, there could be some classified aspects to what it was. That was my initial thought. And I said that, and I defended him. Even though I was critical of the entire story, I did try and, give him some kind of credit. As the time went on, and you research what OSAP actually was, it is public on what they were asking for and soliciting from the general public. What I mean by that is there's a website called fedbizops.gov. Federal Business Opportunities is what it is. This is where they post solicitations for bidding, meaning that if they want somebody to, bid on a contract for whatever type of research program, they post it here as long as it's unclassified, and then corporate America can go in and say, hey, wait, I think we can do this for, $50 million. And they go in, they bid on it, and hopefully they get it. According to the Pentagon, OSAP and AATIP are essentially the same thing. I actually don't believe the Pentagon when they said that, or what I think was AATIP was a sub-project to a bigger one called OSAP, Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program. Documents will bear that out in time. No one can be, proven right at this point, as with everything else. But regardless, they're connected. Like that's what we kind of all agree on, is that there's this program name in 2008. It either morphed into AATIP or AATIP was born out of this program. Whichever way you look at it, it's connected. When you look at the original contract solicitation, it was posted on August 22nd, 2008. It's very, very long, meaning I'm not going to sit here and read it to you. But I bring it up because now I don't defend Mr. Elizondo for bringing it up. I think when you actually look at the original solicitation and really sit down and comprehend what it was all about, whichever way you look at it, whichever way is true, meaning AATIP was born out of OSAP or OSAP became AATIP, whatever, it doesn't matter at this point. When you look at that solicitation, it does not come close in the slightest to describe a UFO research program. It's talking about foreign technology and some aerospace threats and weapon systems and so on. But it doesn't talk about unidentified threats or, it just doesn't, it's not the same. And when you bid on a contract, I'll make it very simplistic. When you bid on a contract to make an apple pie, you don't turn around, bake a turkey, and hope for the best. You don't do that in a government contract. When they ask for X, you have to submit X, and that's it. There's no rewriting it. So the fact that when you look through this original contract solicitation notice, it was DIA that showed the location. It was through the Virginia Contracting Activity Office. When you look at this and you really dissect it, it doesn't come close to what Mr. Elizondo stated AATIP was. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing it up because it further supports and solidifies that AATIP is being blown out of proportion. If OSAP was some kind of looking for, unidentified threats in the sky, potentially trying to analyze weapon, is it a weapon system or so on, and then AATIP was born out of that because they realized, hey, these aren't weapons, they're craft. You can kind of draw, and I know I'm kind of making it a little simplistic there, but you can draw a line and it makes sense. You can then understand because there's certain things you can prove, and when you draw the line from what you can prove to what you think might be reality, if you can kind of make that somewhat easy to do, then you have a solid theory. But when Mr. Elizondo does not bring up OSAP even though it was posted publicly. This isn't top secret information here. It was a public posting. When he was finally called out on it, he said, I don't know exactly what he said off the top of my head, but I know that he just kind of said that that was the name of the project in the beginning, and then it morphed into what AATIP was, and that's when he came about, but he wasn't involved in those, early days. Okay, but when you actually look at it, it actually makes sense then on why he wouldn't bring it up. Why? Because it doesn't support his story. And I think we have to look at that. If this was the only piece of evidence I'd have, I'd say shut off my radio show and stop even listening to it, because that's ridiculous. But this, in addition to everything else, supports that AATIP was not what we are being led to believe. Now, couple all of that, all of the information, with the fact that the New York Times and most of these other, not all, but most of the other media outlets, major ones, they haven't done real big follow-up stories at all. The only time that one of the videos was then talked about again that TTSA had released, it was in an op-ed piece by Christopher Mellon. And that's what's published. Not major journalists from Washington Post or New York Times or whatever. It was an op-ed piece. So you would think that these major media outlets that got an avalanche themselves of publicity, because it all went back to those original, New York Times stories, you would think that they would do a follow-up and make this a big thing. Do 4 or 5 gigantic pieces through the next year. They haven't done one. And I think the reason for that is they realized that after they published this thing, quite possibly, it was not as accurate as we wanted it to be. I'm not placing the accusation, but I'm saying that that's a huge possibility. Because here we are, over a year later from the announcement of this program, almost a year to announcing the name and those original articles that got all that press. And what's happened? Kind of nothing when it comes to the media. Now, some will argue that the media takes the UFO topic more seriously. I've even heard it called the TTSA effect. All right, cool. But I think a lot of people are missing what the reality is with media, and that the print world is dying, and they need clicks. UFOs get clicks. Silly UFO stories are still out there, just as prevalent, but thankfully, yes, there are more serious stories, but I think that's just because they realize they rate really well. I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but I'm being a realist, and that's what a lot of these papers see. But there's a line drawn between getting those clicks and doing a story that's going to go viral and being accurate. And I think that when they publish the story, I think after the fact, maybe it wasn't as accurate as their standards are set out to be. So when it comes to doing follow-ups, your root, where it all came from, is flawed. I honestly believe that is a huge possibility, that's why we are not seeing the follow-ups to AATIP. We see references to, in 2017, story broke about a, top secret UFO study, or however they want to refer to it as. But where's the evidence? If the New York Times claims that they saw it, you'd think that maybe they would release the document. But I don't think they did. I think they probably took Mr. Elizondo at his word. I'm not saying they shouldn't have, but maybe we should have pushed a little bit harder to get that information out. The Pentagon stating that they didn't release those videos is a huge red flag. The Pentagon stating that the program was not what it is a big red flag. Because those documents, the real documents about AATIP, are going to come out eventually. And when they do, it's either going to support Mr. Elizondo or not. But only one side of this epic battle between truth and fiction is asking for $50 million of your dollars. Only one. When you look at the information that they're disseminating, I've just talked about Dr. Eric Davis. Granted, he's not part of TTSA. And if anybody wants to tag him in posts and tell him I talked about him, I don't hide from it. I've tagged him in my comments to some of the erroneous information he has put out there. I know he sees it, but he refuses to respond. Well, let TTSA know I did this show, Because after 4 months of waiting, they finally turned me down. Why? I don't know. My best guess, they're afraid of the truth. They're afraid of answering the questions that need to be asked. Do some of my questions have easy answers? I'm sure they do. Does it prove that they are lying or covering up? I'm sure they probably don't. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask them in the first place. And I'm often ridiculed for pushing for some of these questions to be asked. And again, when you look at that information being disseminated by TTSA itself, not just their outside consultants and people they joined hands with, but they themselves are out there on the world stage giving out false information. Now, quick context here, when they did their press conference, the one in October of 2017, you will never, not once, not a single time, hear me talk about the Mylar balloon that they flashed up on their screen and touted it as a real UFO. That actually happened. TTSA, like a month or whatever later, submitted an apology to the public because they were wrong. They didn't do their research and do their homework, and issued an apology. You'll never see me talk about that once because mistakes happen. I'm not out to make everyone look bad. I'm sure that if somebody dissects every one of my shows and every word that I've said, I'm sure I misspoke. I'm sure I said something that wasn't true. Wasn't intentional, but mistakes happen, right? We're only human, and this is a really confusing topic. So sometimes you might not get something right. So I never harped on them for that. I know some people out there did, even on radio shows that I was on, being asked questions about it. And I didn't jump on the bandwagon and support that. I said, you know what? Mistakes happen. There's enough red flags to focus on versus a mistake about a Mylar balloon. Now, fast forward here to the last couple of weeks. Tom DeLonge and Luis Elizondo went over to Italy. We're doing a conference over there. Somebody had sent me the link to it. Apparently it was live streamed and then later archived. And they said, here, take a look at this. Just by chance, I kind of fast forwarded it because there was some, irrelevant stuff when they started rolling the camera. And they were talking about 1952 and the Washington, D.C. UFO sightings. And I'm listening to him talk, and he was kind of outlining about the fact that UFOs were seen over the Capitol building. I think I talked about that even earlier. It's been a long show now, so I apologize. It's gone on this long. I'm almost done. But he was talking about the 52 Washington sightings. And on the screen behind him were some, bullet points on his PowerPoint and two images. One of which was a CGI animation that I've seen in television. I've actually been on camera on a show that used it. It was CGI UFOs behind the Capitol building. And next to that was a cartoon comic book. It was kind of a drawing and rendition. It wasn't a photograph. And Mr. Elizondo points directly to those photos and says, these are photos from that event. Telling everybody on a world stage and a world audience, looking and pointing at CGI animation stills and saying that they're actual photographs. That to me was the final nail in the coffin, that there is just a lack of appreciation for the decades of work that people have done in this field, and that there is a lack of ability to look at a CGI animation still and realize that that is not a photograph from 1952. Now, I'm not trying to insult the man, so don't get me wrong. What I am trying to say is if you claim that you headed a secret Pentagon UFO study for years, and you come out and you say, give my organization, it's not his, but the one he's involved in, give our organization $50 million because we're going to take the next step with whatever. And he's out there touting pictures of CGI animation as real from 1952. Now all of a sudden that Mylar balloon makes sense. It makes sense that he may not be exactly who he is claiming to be, nor does he have the experience. Now, for those out there who've done UFO research, if you've been around for a while, I'm not saying you have to be a photo analyst, but if you've been around for a little while, you could probably peg lens flare by this point, right? You could probably look at a photo and go, well, wait a minute, you're taking a picture of the sun. Of course you're going to have some kind of, artifact in the camera. You become familiarized with some of the information that's out there. And after years of doing this, and he claimed, Mr. Elizondo claims, that AATIP never stopped and that they were doing things, well beyond the 2012 cutoff date when the Pentagon says that they cut funding because there was no value in it. That's probably why they cut the funding, was that the people heading it could not look at a photograph and say that is a Mylar balloon or that is a CGI animation still. I know that sounds condescending and rude. I don't mean it to be, but that is the logical way to look at it, that if that was the head of the program, this has now gone beyond a human error, which I accept because I make them all the time. It goes beyond that, and it goes to the heart of the credibility of this story, and that's why I did this show. I wanted you guys to hear the real history, the documented history, the real information that's out there, and how the story today does not match up to what we are being led to believe. That when you look at history and common sense, and you look at what really is out there, and you look at the information that you can verify, and you use common sense, I stress that, use common sense, the story does not match up. And that's why I get passionate about all of this, because people often ask me, and in fact, my wife was the one months ago, she said, why do you care? Right? I mean, she didn't quite say it with that attitude, but she asked me, she said, why do you care? Like, does it matter? You're not investing in them, which I never have. You're not, friends with them. What's going on? Like, why do you care? And it took me a second, because I realized I care so much because the real history is more fascinating than fiction. And I have devoted decades of my life to get the mainstream media and the general public, those listening, you that's listening right now, to take this topic seriously. Because my whole audience are not UFO buffs or believers. They're curious and they're willing to learn. So I've made it my life's mission, not only with UFOs, but everything, to make sure that the most accurate information is out there. So when somebody comes along and they say, give us tens of millions of dollars, I did this, but there's a bunch of red flags about what this really was. And when they say that there's some kind of secret UFO study, when in reality, there's kind of no evidence to support that, what are the repercussions of something like that happening? Some fans of TTSA don't like me for saying this, but they are potentially doing more harm than good for this field. Why? Well, why didn't the New York Times do any follow-ups? That's a big question that we need to ask. Maybe they realized the evidence isn't there. Now, when somebody does go to them with real evidence, they may realize, well, we got duped before. Let's just not touch this because this could really backfire. And so the harm in the long run is worse than whatever positive is coming in the short term. Now, there are some positives. Again, there are some more serious stories that are out there, but that doesn't matter. And so going back to what my wife asked me, and what so many people have asked me, why do you care? What's the point? It's because the reality behind all of this is much more important than TTSA getting their $50 million and building a space plane. It's more important than Mr. Elizondo going out there onto a stage in Italy, making a few bucks, and telling everybody this CGI photo is real. This is so much bigger than that. It deserves so much more. I've been in the field for 22 years. There are people that have been in the field more than twice that long. We owe it to people like them. You don't need to listen to me or do it for me. That's not what I'm saying. Do it for them. That they have been in this field and have, researched and fought for answers for decades, and in some cases decades longer than maybe you've even been alive. That in itself, that is where we should give the public more, and that it deserves more. Those that have devoted those years and decades, that's what they That's what they deserve. So I hope that this show brought a little bit more understanding to all of this, a little bit more history, and really kind of gave you some insight of where I'm at. The future, where we are at this point is a waiting game. The final thing that I'll say and bring up is the fact that the Defense Intelligence Agency is that OPR. And they are about 1 year to 2 years behind with FOIA requests, which means it'll be about 2 years before we get anything. At the recording of this episode, since we're almost about 1 year in, and most of the FOIA requests went in roughly December to January of 2017, hopefully by the end of 2019, roughly, we will get answers, start seeing some AATIP documents. Recently there was a report from the Office of the Inspector General from the DIA that talked about the need for reducing the backlog of FOIA requests within the DIA specifically. So they are known to actually have a huge problem on their hands when it comes to the number of FOIA requests. That was just recently. I bring that up because I want you to understand that that is why we haven't seen documents yet. I'm proud of the one single page that I did get that does reference AATIP, the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program. Again, as of the recording, that is the only FOIA document that has ever been released that referenced AATIP. Hopefully soon we will get more. But until TTSA wants to answer questions, they are just simply muddying the waters even more. The water is muddy already. We've had to deal with an awful lot when it comes to the military and the government lying about this. We don't need a public benefit corporation to do the same thing. So if they want to continue to hold information and they want to, continue to hide it from all of us, that's fine. That's no problem. But it's not going to be me losing out in the end. It's going to be them. Their reputation, their fundraising, and their credibility is going to go out the window. So I hope that some of my questions do resonate within them. And in time, hopefully, they will release that quote-unquote chain of custody document, whatever that is. But more than anything else, I hope that they stop giving out wrong information to the public, because the public deserves a heck of a lot more. The truth is a lot stranger than fiction, and sadly, they just keep dishing out the fiction, wanting your money, wanting your investment. Now that investment period is over, there are books to buy, $40 hoodies, or however much they are, clothing lines, and so on. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying you have to look at the intention behind selling nearly everything on your website. That is why I did this show, to hopefully give you guys that insight. Thank you so much for listening. Again, this was just a very special episode based on popular demand to give you some of this information and where we're at. Whenever I get any documents related to AATIP or anything when it comes to the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, or if it comes out that it's aerospace, fine with that too. I will bring that to you at theblackvault.com. This is John Greenewald Jr. signing off. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.